Hey guys, what is up? I'm Tony and this is my channel Activism on the Fly, my portal to becoming a better ally, advocate, and activist. Thanks so much for stopping by and happy Friday. Today I want to talk about education. So pretty much the entire point of this whole activism journey is one of education. I'm learning how to be better, how to do better, how to really stand up for things that I believe in. I am learning a lot. I'm currently reading White Rage, the New York Times bestseller. It's from a historical perspective that addresses systemic racism in America and the building blocks of how we got to where we are today in race relations. Also, great resource for you guys. I mentioned it in a previous video, but I finished the 1619 New York Times podcast, and it is fantastic. One thing that's been really interesting to learn about is basically where we are in terms of disparity in American society by race
in health, education, income, and wealth
are not an accident. There's a root to each one of them and a calculated reason for things being the way that they are today. If you don't go looking for that information as a white American, you can just think kind of this is the way things are. And the truth is, things are the way they are because people have decided that they should be all along the way. So there's an immediate need right now to ensure that Black people are not being killed and victims of violence. And that's the number one priority, to make sure that justice is working more equally than it is now. But from where I'm sitting, one of the most important reforms that we can ask for is an education. I'm not talking about the type of education reform where all children have equal access to a good quality education and that resources are distributed more evenly to ensure that. I believe all of that. However, what I'm talking about is curriculum reform. I'm talking about rewriting textbooks, telling the truth. The fact is, we've done a lot of revising, editing, and fluffing up of stories to make them easier to swallow and digest. We hear the myth of Washington and his wooden teeth, and not that he wore the teeth of slaves. I'm coming from a place of already feeling like I'm pretty woke, I'm pretty well educated, and I have kind of a heart for social justice. I just always have. It's where my conscience guides me. And beyond that, I love learning. I am still a student at 34 because I can't stop taking classes. So for me, I'm going out of my way. I'm getting as much information as I possibly can, and I'm trying to digest it all, and I'm trying to be as educated as possible. For someone else who doesn't want to go out and do that extra work to learn things that they haven't already learned, for someone else who already has a certain set opinion of the way things are and doesn't want to hear, they're not going to go out and seek that information. I don't think that this should be optional information to learn. I think that we should learn the truth when we're children in school, so that we don't have to be 34-year-olds learning, and so that we don't have to be 34-year-olds deciding not to know. I see a lot of people on social media defending Confederate statues and flags in the name of remembering history. I'm with all those people. Let's not forget history, and let's actually teach our kids the truth. One little bit of truth for those proponents of keeping Confederate statues and flags around is that the Confederate flag didn't start hanging on public buildings until the Civil Rights Movement. Before that, it wasn't displayed. The reason the flag started to be displayed was because Black people wanted equal rights. The intent is clear based on when it became such a public icon. I think that we do a disservice to all of our citizens when we fairy tale and Disney things up, and when we whitewash them, and when we make history a lot more comfortable by leaving out certain bits and by altering other bits. It's important that all American kids learn this history, not just Black kids whose families have bought them Rosa Parks Autobiography so that they know the truth, and not just for Black activists. This is important history for everyone to learn, including white kids in schools. Y'all, I'm kind of bummed. I really wanted to film outside today. It's such a beautiful day, but the wind had other plans. It is hella strong, and I just couldn't sit out there anymore. So in the name of decent audio quality, here we are. So a common refrain that I hear people saying when they don't want to talk about issues of race, whether that is
inequality, the wealth gap, health disparities, reparations,
is slavery ended in 1863 if they're like smarties and no dates. People will say that as if that meant the end of racism in America. And you know what? It really didn't. People say that not knowing about Juneteenth. Embarrassingly, I just learned about Juneteenth this year. For large swaths of enslaved peoples, they were enslaved for 2 additional years after emancipation. People will say this not knowing about the Freedmen's Bureau and how lands granted to formerly enslaved people once they were free as a means of giving them some kind of basis for an economically sound future were just snatched away from them. President Johnson decided that he would rather help poor white people. So he removed these black landowners from their land that had been gifted them after generations of toiling for free for other people's profits, and gave this land to poor whites, or allowed former plantation owners to take over the land. If you're one of those I hate handouts people, just think about the fact that these formerly enslaved people have been giving the handout of their body in free labor for their entire life. And then also think about the fact that the land was redistributed to white folks. People say this: slavery ended in 1863, not knowing that Lincoln, the great emancipator, had no interest in giving African Americans equal rights, and actually wanted to put them all on another boat and send them to what is now Panama for their own colony. You see, Lincoln, he did a good thing and he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But we must realize that this was ideological. It was because for the Union to be a dignified civil society, to live up to its ideals of freedom and equality, they couldn't ever be this or do this while practicing slavery. And this is why slavery had to be abolished in Lincoln's eyes, but not because Black people deserved an equal place in society amongst their white peers. Slavery ended, get over it, people say, not realizing that President Johnson vetoed the 1866 Civil Rights Bill that gave African Americans the right to vote. Congress overrode him, and that would be the only time in history that Congress has ever overridden a presidential veto. People say slavery ended as if they don't know that after the ratification of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, giving every man the right to vote, regardless of race, states were given free rein to create their own voting regulations, and what do you know? Literacy tests, poll taxes, all kinds of obstacles were put in place to deter Black people from voting. If racism ended with slavery, Martin Luther King wouldn't have been marching in Selma in 1965 for access to voting rights. And now that the Supreme Court, as of 2013, has rolled back the protections from the Voting Rights Act, wouldn't you know those same states, largely in the South, that back in the Civil Rights era were creating arbitrary and malicious barriers to voting, have created a whole litany of new restrictions and obstacles to overcome to exercise one's right to vote. These restrictions were put in place almost immediately after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. So many of the things that we learn when we're children in school learning about the Civil Rights era is very flawed, if not outright wrong. Let's take, for example, Rosa Parks. I was told in school, like probably many of you were, that Rosa Parks was this old woman who had worked all day and she just sat down in a seat on the bus because her feet hurt. When someone asked her to get up, she just said no because I'm tired and my feet hurt, and you know, it was all an accident, it just happened. And that's how she accidentally became the famous activist that she is. Does that sound about right? Cool. It's completely wrong. Rosa Parks, one, was not old. She was 42, only 8 years older than I am right now. She had worked 6 hours. Maybe she was tired from working, but not in terms of exhaustion, falling asleep on the bus. She could have stood up if she wanted to. She didn't because she chose not to. Rosa Parks had been an activist for racial justice for 2 decades, 20 years, before this incident on the bus made her famous. For some reason, the story has been changed over time to tell our children in school this nice old granny lady just didn't feel like standing up. I went through my whole childhood educational career thinking Rosa Parks was like a grandmother. I'm not exactly sure what the reason is to make her seem more sympathetic to the peaceful movement that American schools like to talk about. Is this to make Black people sound less powerful or less threatening? Rosa Parks wrote her autobiography in response to these lies being told about her. She wasn't having it. And that's just one civil rights story that we got wrong. Why is it in all of the civil rights movement, the only person that we're taught in any real depth about is Martin Luther King? We learn about Rosa Parks, but we learn inaccurate information. Malcolm X is vilified, if not omitted, from most textbooks. And I'm sure that it's because he believed in using violence to fight oppression. I'm sure it's a lot easier for white Americans to stomach the thought of peaceful protests doing the trick and working. That's not really how it goes. I mean, after a certain point of asking to have your human rights instated to no avail, what are you supposed to do? Just keep turning your cheek while they strike you? Why is it that we don't learn about Paul Robeson, Medgar Evers, Marcus Garvey, Barbara Jordan, John Lewis, W.E.B. Du Bois, for whom the campus library of my alma mater was named, James Meredith, Richard and Mildred Loving, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Height? There are so many other activists and civil rights leaders that we could be learning about, not taking anything away from the great legacy that Dr. King carved out in his time on this planet. But what I am saying is there are reasons that only Dr. King's story is taught in classrooms in America. Racism is baked into American systems of governance, into healthcare, into housing, into education, into employment. Nothing having to do with race relations or inequality is a coincidence. Every inequality is the result of systematic, calculated moves that have created those systems. There are winners and losers, and it is on purpose by design. Slavery ended. People should pick themselves up by their bootstraps and make it work. Right? Be self-made, the American dream. What about Black families with down payments and good credit who weren't allowed to move into certain neighborhoods? What about the fact that education is tied to property tax and therefore more affluent neighborhoods and cities have better education? Double whammy. What about how Black homeowners were among the first people targeted for the subprime mortgages that eventually caused the financial collapse of 2008? We learn about Jim Crow laws in school, and then we learn about Martin Luther King marching to victory, turning the other cheek. We don't learn about the impact that those Jim Crow laws had. We don't learn about how healthcare was segregated, how hospital staff just didn't treat Black patients. Value was put on certain lives and not on others, and the effects of that have trickled down through generations. Black women are dying more frequently during childbirth than their white peers, and way more than anybody should be in a developed world power. People will talk today about protesters looting and rioting. We don't ever talk about looting and rioting when it's in the context of white Americans doing it. I don't hear about Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Black Wall Street, or how after a newspaper printed an article that a Black man tried to rape a white woman, white people in the area burned down 35 blocks of the most affluent Black district in the country. We don't talk about the fact that during the Black Wall Street massacre, 300 people died and 800 were injured. That 9,000 people formerly living a comfortable middle or upper middle class existence became homeless in a matter of 2 days. We don't learn that the percentage of Black farmers in America has gone from 14% in 1910, in line with proportion of population, down to 1.6% in 2012. We don't learn that that's because of discriminatory practices by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. but it's true. And there's a $1.2 billion payout from lawsuits to prove it. For white Americans who don't want to accept culpability for the sins of their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, no one's asking you to personally say that racial injustice is your fault. But when presented with factual information, it would be good if you tried to digest it. For younger generations who are coming up through our school systems and who will be in the future, I don't believe that this should be optional. I don't believe that we should be leaving this work of understanding history up to people in their 20s and 30s to learn at that point. Teach them while they're still in school. And though it would be difficult to have the conversations of, yes, Lincoln freed the slaves, but he actually was racist too, those are important conversations. And teachers, parents, and children can all learn a whole lot more from those true and nuanced conversations than they can from believing there's a good guy and there's a bad guy and there was slavery and then it ended and then we were equal and then Obama. That has never been the reality of American history. I'm relearning things I was lied to about as a child. We're never going to get past this place that we're at now if we don't acknowledge the true history of America. Whew. That was longer than I expected. So that's going to be it for today. I'll leave links below with information on educational reform so that you guys can be part of the solution too. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, sticking around. If you like this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up so I know. If you want to follow along on this journey for more activism related content, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. I'd love to have you on this journey. Have a great weekend, everybody. Be safe.